This lecture supports Module 2 and is a brief discussion of the physical and cultural contexts for world regional geography. What I'm going to try to do in this lecture is suggest that we understand the world as regions and that some aspects of the physical and cultural world support those regions and others may challenge them. So let's begin. If we think about world regions, what we want to really ask ourselves is, what does this mean and why do human beings need this? From a physical standpoint, what we want to think about is that we divide the world into regions, and you'll notice here on this is again a Mercator projection, so the world is slightly distorted to the north. But what we see are a group of large land masses. In a sense, this is the world from space. And so it makes sense to certainly divide the world here along the Atlantic Basin, and here the Pacific Basin divides it in terms of our Pacific region. But beyond those two divisions, the Atlantic and Pacific Basins, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense to divide the world much further from a purely physical landmass sense. We can certainly make the argument along the Isthmus of Panama here, perhaps, to make a subdivision, and here what is sometimes called Wallace's Line that divides Australia from the rest of the Eurasian landmass. But beyond those divisions, it really is hard to justify the regions that we see in the world. So let's begin to kind of pull this apart a little further. Now, if we go and look at human population, what we see in this map, and you'll see this in the story maps, the world looks very different. Again, human population density is shown on this map, and that is the number of people per unit area. And what you see here is that we have some distinct cores. We see the European core of high population density. We see absolutely the South Asian cone, and you'll notice right here, we see this extremely high population density, and that's along what we call the Ganges or the Ganga River. And then we have the East Asian core in the eastern part of China. Those three major population centers certainly could be understood as distinct regions. The rest of the world looks relatively low in terms of its population density. So that doesn't really support anything more than, sometimes we talk about the South Asian region, and we certainly talk about East Asia, but it doesn't really help us with anything else. Now, if we look at the world, and this is, again, you'll see this in your story map, this is what they call night lights, or the world at night. And strictly speaking, it is not the light, but it is a composite of data in terms of population and energy use. And the world looks a little bit different. Those high concentrations in East and Southeast Asia become somewhat less dominant, but we begin to see the North American presence, and that is in part due to our large use of energy. And so each of these is a layer that we can look at the world and say, well, things are different in different places. We certainly can divide the African continent from the Euro-Asian region because of its lack of light, or at least energy use. We can see the same thing in terms of the division between North and South America. So each of these pieces adds to our understanding of how we see the world. Now we can also begin to ask the question in terms of how do humans interact with our environment. And I do want to show a couple of slides quickly here. This happens to be the largest open pit mine in the world. It's located in Utah. And what I wanted to point out was something of the scale of human activity. Humans impact the environment in significant ways, and in fact, the level of impact may also be understood as a reason for defining region. Those of you that are from Slippery Rock, it's worth understanding the magnitude. What I've done, again, this is the largest open pit. It's a copper mine in Utah, and it's at the exact same scale that we'll see in the next slide, the area that is Slippery Rock. So again, put this in perspective. The size, here's Slippery Rock. In fact, if you are on campus right now, you'd be sitting in this little tiny area right here. And now put that in the context of that copper mine. That copper mine effectively stretches almost from where we would be in Slippery Rock to pretty close to halfway to Grove City. So a massive impact on the environment. And those impacts, the way we impact the environment, also influences how we understand regions. Okay, so what I want you to take away from your first set of readings are three kind of ideas. And this is environmental change and the way we use the environment matters in terms of how we understand regions and in fact how we understand space and place. So again, three ideas. Climate matters. Where people are is influenced by their climate. And we change our homes, we modify where we are, but we're somewhat limited by the environment. And the more that we change our environment, in some respects, the more we limit our options. So think about those three ideas. Climate matters. People live where they do because of their climate regimes. We do modify our environment. Human beings are remarkably effective at that. And lastly, when we change our environment, we change our options. Okay. So, what do we mean by climate? Well, remember, weather, what many of you are experiencing right now, is the temperature, wind speed, air pressure, and precipitation today, or tomorrow, or the next day. It is an instantaneous way of understanding our environment in some respects. Climate, on the other hand, is temperature, circulation patterns, and precipitation over long periods. In other words, it's like an average. It's like your overall GPA for your entire college career, as opposed to what did you do in class today, okay, long-term versus short-term. All right. Now, what I would like you to think about when you look at your story maps are how these things vary and how they might be understood as an influence on how we understand regions. So, for example, you'll look at temperature. This happens to be the July temperature. And what you'll notice, again, red being higher temperature averages, blue being colder, we see this general belt through the middle of the world, equatorially, that has very high temperatures, with a couple notable exceptions. Please note right here, this is the Tibetan Plateau, and its average temperature is much, much lower because it's much higher in altitude. Now, if we look at it in January, what we'll notice is that in the northern hemisphere, that is these very large land masses across Eurasia and North America, our January temperatures become very, very low. And in fact, they are, in some respects, inhospitable to human occupation. Precipitation is another aspect of climate, and again, what we see are a couple of slight differences here. We see these extremely high precipitation areas in the Amazon basin, the Niger-Congo region here, and across the Indonesian archipelago. Precipitation is important, but precipitation has to be in a reasonable amount. Many of you that live near Erie in the last week noticed that too much precipitation in the form of snow can be a bad thing. Now, if we put these all together, what we see is something we call length of growing season. And this is the amount of days, weeks, months that a region has in terms of growing food crops. And one of the important things that I want you to note is that there are extremely long growing seasons, again, in these tropical areas, but also in the United States, we have a fairly significant length of growing season. And in some parts of Southern Europe, we have the same thing. East Asia and South Asia also have considerably long growing seasons. Now, sometimes that translates into food productivity, and sometimes it doesn't. Now, again, let's put those pieces back together. If we think about the long growing seasons, we'll notice that in West Africa, we see that, in fact, population density is moderately high there. We see, though, also that in South and East Asia, with only moderately good climates, we have extremely high population densities. So climate and population doesn't always coincide. In some cases, in fact, in the Amazon basin, they almost are inverted. But climate and people are a factor that we want to look at in terms of how we understand regions. Now, we also, again, as I said, we change our homes. This map shows forest loss in terms of world forest loss. And this is a number of different data sets brought together to simply show where the greatest stresses in these areas have been. And one of the things that you should note is that we are showing extremely high levels of loss in these equatorial wet regions, and those are in fact areas of tropical rainforest. Expansion of people into those areas. You'll also notice that in the eastern part of North America, these are also areas of moderately high and continued forest cover change. So again, we change our environment. Habitat loss is perhaps a more full way of looking at that change. When we talk about habitat loss, that simply means that the natural habitat has been modified into something for human activity. And I want to just look at a couple of regions and you'll see what I mean by this. If we look at the United States or North America as a region, one of the things that we'll notice is that habitat loss throughout the middle of the continent is extremely high. This is where we have changed the landscape into something for our own food production. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily that that's a bad environment. By no means is it a bad environment. It simply means that it's an environment that is human. We can see it even more completely in Europe, and perhaps this is one way of understanding the European region. Europe is an area that has virtually completely altered its landscape to meet human needs. You'll notice that in much of the area, between 60 and 90% of habitat has been lost to human activity. Now, in sub-Saharan Africa, you'll notice that that loss is significantly less. Now, there are areas of significant loss. You'll notice mostly Uganda here, for example, Côte d'Ivoire. Both of these areas are for commercial production. Coffee primarily here, and cacao or chocolate here. As we look across the Eurasian landmass, though, we notice that where the climate was inhospitable, we've lost very little habitat, although deforestation is beginning to encroach in that area. So in some respects, climate protects regions. Now, what is left in terms of arable land? This is arable. Arable land means land that can be used for cultivation. And what this indicates is arable land that has yet to be cultivated. Again, if we look at North America, we see that there is still land that can be converted, especially in our southeast. And so again, once we convert, we change our options. So what percent of arable land is left matters. Now, let's begin to look at a little bit at a different way of seeing the world, and that's in terms of culture. And very quickly, I want to define the idea of culture. Culture is the beliefs, practices, and technology that humans bring to bear in their environment. Culture is learned. And that's one of the most important ideas about it. Culture is not inherited, but it is learned. And I just want to look at two examples of culture, that of religion and that of language. And again, you're going to be doing reading on this, so I just want to point out some ideas to think about when we map them. Remember that when we talk about religion, we're talking about religions, and we're going to put them in two big camps, if you will. Universalizing, meaning religions that want other people to become part of them, and ethnic, those that are defined by an ethnicity or a group. And so, for example, Judaism is ethnic. You really can't become Jewish. A Jewish person doesn't go out and try to convert the world to Judaism. Universalizing, Christianity is kind of the classic example. That is that Christian belief system wants all people to become part of it. Now, one of the things that we're going to notice then in that is that the universalizing religions have occupied essentially those areas that were colonized. And so you'll notice that throughout much of North and South America, much of sub-Saharan Africa, and the spread of Islam, again, another of the world's great universalizing religions, these are expansive religions. In contrast, Hinduism and Judaism occupy very, very small areas of the world. And so different landscapes of that culture. And they help us define different regions. In a like manner, you're going to be looking lastly at language. And remember that language families are not what we speak, but groups of what we speak. And I just want to point out one, which is the Indo-European. And if you notice, the Indo-European populations that are speakers here in pink occupy, in a sense, the history of European expansion throughout the world, either colonially or migratorily. So As you look at these regions, or these themes, what I want you to think about is, can you divide the world into regions based on them? Do they make sense? So finish up your writing assignment, finish up the chapters, and take the quiz. We'll see you in Module 3.